Today on Land Talk, we are joined by Brian Latta, an experienced developer and a partner at Caroch Development. Brian has played a key role in delivering several large-scale industrial and institutional projects across multiple markets and sectors. Most recently, Brian headed Bridge Industrial's development platform in Florida, one of the most active developers in the market. During his tenure, they acquired, entitled, and developed 22 sites, 750 acres, and 10 million square feet of Class A industrial. Brian's team was NAIOP's Developer of the Year 5 times. Very impressive. Brian brings a practical perspective on what makes land truly viable, how to navigate infrastructure and entitlement challenges, and where the industrial market is heading next.
Thank you for having me. I think you did a nice job of kind of introducing me and my background. I'm from South Florida. I grew up in Plantation, went away for college, got degrees in finance and then construction management, and then came back here for the last 25 years and been either on the construction side or the development side in this marketplace ever since. Except for a short stint when I was up in New York, New Jersey, and Philadelphia. I've been down here most of my career.
Very few people that can say that they're from here, right?
Which I think is one of the great things about Miami or South Florida in general. So eclectic, so diverse, and so, we get so many different people.
What originally drew you to industrial land development, and what did you learn early on that still shapes how you evaluate land today?
I think like most people, you fall into things, right? It wasn't where I started my career, but I have been doing it for like the last 17 years, almost strictly industrial. And I like it. I think that my skill sets and my background played very nice with it. And so, but it's easy to understand, it's access, location, scale, size, and cost. So it's not about color or style or a moment in time. It's timeless. I like it from that standpoint. If you can find the land at the right place and build it at the price that makes sense, everything works. As opposed to in prior lives, I did office buildings, and then you're always fighting over how much money you're going to put into the lobby, and is it really going to turn to a higher rent or return? In warehouses, it's location, location, location. So, and function.
I believe it's so much more straightforward, right? I would say it's like the commercial when someone is, between residential and commercial, and residential is just so complex. There's so much emotional and so many other things. I think that's like the office of the commercial, right? And industrial is just so straightforward and much more easier.
And what's great right now is that down here, right, it's very difficult to do. There's been a shift in the market recently in the last decade where South Florida has become a tier 1 market. And so all the institutions need to be here. But B, initially, 20 years ago, the center of the world for industrial distribution was Ohio. And it was Ohio because you could reach 65% of the population in a 2-day drive. That's not good enough anymore. We want it in 2 hours. The smart people figured out that if you look at a logistics firm and you figure out how much they spend on transportation, it's 50% of the budget. And how much they spend on real estate, it's 5% of the budget. So with Florida's population growing, they came to the realization that we can double our cost of rent, go from 5% of our budget, 10% of our budget. We can half our distribution cost from 50% to 25%. So that theme has been reoccurring in many of these markets that are growing markets. So instead of keeping your stuff 2 days away in Ohio, bring it closer to the population and your overall costs go down of distribution. So that's been a very positive trend for the industrial market in the last, as I said, 15 years, and Florida explosive growth has been helpful.
And when you look at a raw industrial site, what are the 3 things you assess before deciding whether it's worth pursuing or not?
I like that you limit it to 3 because there's so many things and I have to refer to my notes. But I think, so it's location, access, and connection are the first things that you kind of look at, make sure the site functions. Some of the sites are too small. You can't get the circulation you need for these trucks or for your product type that you're trying to do. And then access is always important. How close is to the intersections? Can you get the circulation? So both of those things would kill the deal. You can kind of look at it and get an idea based on past precedent and the regulatory framework to get an idea of whether it will work. The next thing is site size and site grades. So after you pay for the land, the next biggest cost item you have on any industrial project, the dock high industrial project, is the cost to fill. And so the difference between one site and the other could be $10 million based on how much fill you have to import. And you don't really know that until you get through the civil engineering and have some idea of what you're dealing with. So that's a question of how far along you go in the due diligence. And the last is the history. I like to know what the site was before. If in South Florida, especially in Miami-Dade, we have this thing called the urban development boundary line, which is a arbitrary line that says you can't build out here. It's not that it's wetlands or it's protected by Miami-Dade County. And so it constrains development into the more urban areas. It forces us. And the problem we obviously have in industrial is that we need enormous tracts of land, and that's harder and harder to find. What I like to look for on the history is now that I'm dealing with secondhand land, what was it before? And the benefit of industrial is that of all the sites that I developed down here, 75% of them were contaminated. And through the development process, we cleaned them up and remediated. We're a secondary benefit in addition to bringing jobs, and we're cleaning up sites that you wouldn't otherwise think of. So I feel good about it, at least from my standpoint. My daughter, may think that developers are evil.
Everybody sees us as tree killers and stuff like that, when there is so much more than that. And I believe there's a lot of pluses as well, like you just said. Absolutely.
The other thing about the industrial, just to harp on that for a minute, is I'm working on a couple of projects where it's land. Economists do analysis of the economic impact of an industrial development, and by far it is superior to a lot of the others in terms of the economic impact, jobs, GDP growth. And then the other thing is that's not really well known is that in terms of different uses, multifamily, single family, commercial, retail, industrial is less intensive. It's kind of contrary to your belief, is less intensive on traffic than you would think. A fifth of what office center would be in a 20% or one over, I got to get my numbers right, but it's fractional from both retail and office. So when you look at the net impact of, what people complain about down here is the traffic, even though you look at the big trucks, there are fewer of them and they take less time, believe it or not, than it would if you use that same land as retail or office or others. So I'm working on one site right now where the net reduction in trips, it's, a large office building. As a matter of fact, one of the buildings we recently did was Ryder Corporate Headquarters. It's 250,000 square foot office building. There are no impact fees because the impact of office that we demoed far offset the larger industrial buildings that we built there. It's a net positive from a sense of use of resources relative to some of the other uses. And that's me obviously trying to convince people to approve the use. But to be honest with you, I didn't think about this until a development director of one of the towns that I was developing in came in and says, "We love you guys." And I'm like, "Why?" He says, "Because you don't use resources, you pay your taxes, and you don't vote." So from a standpoint from him, it was just net positive cash flow without any aggravation. I thought about that a lot. I said, "Could you put that in writing?" I would really appreciate that.
Are you targeting smaller infill sites or large scale logistics campuses right now? I mean, I see that all these 250,000 square feet monsters going up. I mean, Coral Springs, I think there's one that a couple of years ago just went up. I believe Butters was the builders. It's just incredible how they get bigger and bigger.
The last two buildings I built were 800,000 square feet, twin 800,000 square foot buildings. And the smallest you could subdivide those buildings to was 200,000 square feet. Each building was 13 football fields. It's enormous. The truth is where the market is going is larger and larger, more and more efficient spaces as DCs move to South Florida. So, but the need overwhelmingly is small bay. Normally what happens is you build these big buildings and then first generation, it's one tenant, second generation, it's two tenants, third generation, it's four tenants, and they become smaller and smaller spaces. But some of these buildings don't lend themselves to that. When you look at the cost of building a very small space, the costs are so high that the rents just become, hard to underwrite.
I would say that those smaller ones are more for like owner users, right? That are just building it for themselves and not an investor coming to look.
The institutional money that's more about I can invest in this or that. But if you're from South Florida and you're going to stay in South Florida, then I think these are all great investments, long-term holds. But if you're trying to make private equity returns and get in and get out, you're going to be overpaying for the land and it'll be hard to hit.
And what is the most misunderstood part of the entitlement process for industrial land, in your opinion?
Until you're entitled, you have no rights. You're going to a public hearing with people voting, good day, bad day, quorum, no quorum, all sorts of things happen, and deals die because time kills all deals. And it is all about the process, managing the process. I think people think they have rights for their land, prior to having land use and zoning, but the truth is until you have land use and zoning, you're really not sure what you found.
And how do you underwrite entitlement risk when timelines and political factors can shift unexpectedly? Like you said, time is everything, right? So sometimes you get government changes and commissioners and people that go in and out.
We're never trying to force a warehouse into a market that doesn't want us. I mean, the first thing that I do is I meet with the city and the public officials and I ask them, what do you think? Get their opinion. And they're dead set against it. It's not worth the fight unless you already bought the land. The amount of money, the amount of time, the amount of brain damage to try and convince somebody, they want something in their backyard. That was probably one of the first experiences of my career when I was working for Toll Brothers Realty Trust. And I was in this neighborhood in Morristown, New Jersey, trying to get something approved that was never going to happen. And eventually you pull the plug, but after you spent $500,000 on legal fees.
Do you find that community attitudes toward industrial developments have changed in recent years?
I think they changed dramatically over a couple of decades ago. For two reasons. I told you what the city official told me about how he sees industrial development, but also, I think maybe 20, 30 years ago, they started, even early, maybe the late 80s, 90s, they started upgrading the warehouses so that a front door and a back door. Before that, your warehouse was over here and your office was downtown. It was Codina, Styles, and a few others that started to realize that, hey, if we put some amenities, we put landscape it, make it a front door and a back door, people can locate their office and their warehouse in the same place. That's been the trend where, and I think people appreciate that, so they don't have to drive downtown.
We're in Weston here, and we have a lot of those where the 20% office, 80% warehouse, which is a great product. Everybody asks me about this data centers, right? How critical is the power availability today, especially with the growth of those centers, and not only the growth center, but cold storage and advanced manufacturing, which they require a vast power capability. I haven't seen a data center in our Tri-County area. Is there one that you know of?
I know there's existing ones, but I have not seen a new one. I have met, as a matter of fact, when I was managing a project in Doral, we had a hyperscaler come out, and it was to talk to us about what their needs were. As you point out, it really comes down to power. They needed a 40 megawatt substation, which meant Florida Power and Light wanted 3 acres of land dedicated to them for free, which is worth $9 million. So they're not going to give it back when the hyperscaler moves out. So it was a really hard deal to underwrite if you have to give away land in order to get the power. And then how long do you have to wait for the power? But of all the deals that I've done down here, it's only those hyperscalers that I've seen have been a huge problem. Probably a standard data center too. Cold storage has high power demands. I did a 300,000 square foot cold storage in Hialeah and was no problem servicing the power. What has been a problem in the past during COVID was there was shortages of certain materials, transformers, disconnects. I did a deal where the monthly rent was $400,000 and I had to give them 9 months free rent for a $35,000 part because I couldn't get the power turned on. It was just the craziest thing. I have not had a problem getting power except for a data center. And the other requirement that's been out there recently has been electric vehicle chargings, but for buses and trucks. So people are trying to source locations where they can get the power. What I find interesting is that you can't just go ask FP&L, where is the power? Because it's obviously of national security. They won't answer it. They'll tell you, if you ask them a specific site, they'll tell you, and then you can go down a path of how long is it going to take to get the power there. It's not as easy to figure it out. So there's probably some data centers out there in play, but if I were to pick a location, I would say they should move down to Homestead near Turkey Point.
Absolutely. And I haven't even seen, we were talking about it at one of our ALC meetings the other day, and Bill Eschenbaugh, he asked to the room, he's like, have you guys seen any that has actually been able to get a site and where they have the capacity that they need? And everybody said no. Yeah, I know those are going to be tough ones.
There was a site that sold and it just retraded. It was in Flagler. I think it's in Flagler Station. It was a 6-acre site. A data center bought it and then flipped it to somebody else because I think they needed a bigger size or they realized it wasn't going to be big enough.
And remember that site that we spoke about in Oakland Park, 40 acres, that is a landfill as well, that it was next to an closed landfill that was leased by the city. That's supposed to be also a data center coming up, but that's going to take a few years. Have infrastructure constraints killed deals for you, and what have those experiences taught you?
Hopefully you won't fall into that trap. I have been surprised by a couple of things. I had a fellow developer building in a park that I was building in, and he got delayed because I had not finished or conveyed my sewer line. We were friends. I felt bad, but I couldn't get the sewer line conveyed, and he was delayed because he was waiting on an approval for my project. So I've seen that before. The biggest biggest thing that I've seen that kills deals down here, that has surprised developers more often than not, is that they underestimate the cost of the fill and they underestimate the time it's going to take. Now, fill, I think, is just a unique thing that's happened recently. Miami-Dade County passed a couple of laws in the last 2 years that have had a massive impact on the cost of fill. So if you happen to have a project that you budgeted prior to those laws, you may have a bust in your pro forma you're not even aware of. But I've been on, worked on several projects where I've been trying to help people with that particular problem. And it's just everything else. They know how much the building costs, they know the land, everything, but they didn't underestimate how much fill they were going to need.
And do you find that the industrial land market is cooling, stabilizing, or still expanding in your opinion?
Well, nationwide, we've come around the corner. I think nationally, industrials pick back up. I think we've had a 2-year hiatus where we, overbuilt in many of the markets after COVID. And I think Florida was late to the party in terms of getting that message. So now we are seriously pulling back on development. And so that has had a cooling effect, I would say. But the truth is no one's selling land at a discount, right? If you're a land speculator, you bought it, you're holding it for 10 years, you'll hold it for another 10 years. So why discount? It's only if you find somebody who's desperate. And the truth is that I think there's more desperation on the capital side of the equation than there is on the land side. As a tier one market, most of the pension funds increased their allocation to industrial over the last 10 years. So they have to spend more. And this market being a market that they want to invest in, they have to get in. So the last time I sold a building, an industrial building down here, a Class A industrial building, there were 19 bidders. Only one got it. So that's 18 people wishing that they got that building. So the way they're doing it is by being the JV partner, bringing the money to the table. And some can do it, some can't based on their risk tolerance or their ability. But I haven't seen a cooling. No one's discounting land. It's getting harder and harder to find. So if you got land, get it now. And the other part is, even though I told you that we're a little behind the curve, 12, 18 months, we're a growing, market. It's going to get absorbed and they're not making any more land.
How has the rise of e-commerce and last mile distribution changed the type of sites that you pursue?
Well, we'll pursue a site specifically for an e-commerce user, but it hasn't changed the sites that we think make sense or that we would buy, build, and develop anyways. And it doesn't change the way we construct our buildings for the most part, right? Our buildings are efficient and designed to host a variety of uses if you build to the same standards. It hasn't really affected us other than that there's been an increase in demand for industrial space down here.
And do you think that the users are prioritizing speed to delivery over perfect location? Because you mentioned before, which is so true, and sometimes, there's cities that are easier than others. So have you seen that maybe they pick a location because that specific city will be easier to work with than a better location in another one?
I think that's definitely true, but I think we locate ourselves close to the highways, close to what makes sense from a distribution standpoint. I think it's a natural aggregate of requirements. But what you are seeing is some shifts, right? One of the interesting shifts, I think, is South Dade. As I mentioned, I had an economist write this report and tell me what's going on. And part of his comments were that 65% of the population lives south of A Street, but only 10% of the jobs are south of A Street. And some other number about the warehouse distribution, right? There's really very little Class A industrial distribution south of A Street. At Bridge, we would never play in that market, but the population growth of South Dade and Homestead in particular, so Miami-Dade population is supposed to grow 3% next year. South Dade is going to grow at 6%. That's where all the land is. The real challenge is getting down there. So if we can move jobs and industry down there, that will take some of the burden off the roads.
And how are capital markets influencing land pricing right now?
Well, as I said before, I think in areas where land is abundant, it's had a chilling effect in some of the markets. But in markets like this, where it takes you for years to get it entitled, people are still trying to tie up land today. I have not seen any real discounts.
I assume that you're seeing more, because of this, you're seeing more joint ventures in the institutional partners and developers that are taking more risk independently?
They want the asset in the end, right? They don't want to sell it, they want to own it. And so they are being joint venture partners as opposed to just buying at market, because so few assets, Class A industrial assets, trade. As I said, the market right now, if you didn't buy the land 3 years ago, you're probably not buying it on spec today.
I have so many, deals lately that are just not penciling because of, specific in our Tri-County, that are not penciling density because of the land cost.
And it's the fully improved cost of the land, right? If you've got a land that it may be a lower price, but now you got to pay for wetlands, which is hundreds of thousands of dollars an acre, or the fill, which is, as I mentioned. So it's hard to make sense. I think land prices peaked at the Calder racetrack in a Siege's site up north, $2.5 and $3 million an acre. At those numbers, you're looking at, if a warehouse today, the last trade I saw was 209 or 309 a square foot. The land under that building today is probably $160 of the cost. So it's overwhelmingly, you got to buy the land right.
And what has been your most challenging project? And what would you do differently if you could redo it?
It's like, which child do you love the most? I love them all. But I think the one that I'm most proud of is one called BPCC, which was a 180-acre site. Half of it was clean. Half of it was actually the city of Surfside's landfill from 1950 to 1974. So it's a class 1 landfill, true garbage, but it wasn't like a mountain 100, 200 feet in the air. It was about 12 feet. And so we had to move the trash around and build a foundation system to put it on. 90 acres that was clean paid for the 90 acres that were dirty. It took 5 years to work through all the approvals and the regulatory and to get it developed. But in the end, we spent the equivalent on 90 acres, $50 million overnight. That land is now suitable for warehouse distribution, and it was worth $200 million. So that was a good return. And then on top of that, we built 800,000 square foot buildings. I'm proud of that because A, it's repurposing. It's 100% recycling, right? You took a landfill and recycled the entire thing because it's part of your building. The other interesting thing about building on a landfill that I hadn't thought about is, one of the biggest costs I told you is fill. The fill was free. I spent $50 million capping it, but my building is 9 feet higher than the neighbor's building. I will never flood. I'm already a 4-foot high building, but I am so much more hardened than the neighboring property. I'm using material that would normally just go into a landfill because it was a landfill. I mean, it's just an interesting opportunity that we stumbled upon. And since that time, I don't know if you know County Line, that's a C&D landfill, or Solomia, which is where copied a lot of what we did, which is a project up in North Miami Beach.
Who would have thought that you had 180 acres in there? That sounds like...
We thought the city of Surfside had a landfill in Miami Gardens. I thought that was also interesting. It's like, city of Surfside? Really? I guess back then, that's where you took your garbage.
What is one red flag that immediately makes you walk away from a site?
PFAS, PFOA. It's the forever chemical. I don't know if you've been hearing about it. It's similar to Teflon. It's a chemical that was created back in the 50s or 60s. It's got, magical properties, but it's what's called a forever chemical, and it's carcinogen at very low levels. It's been known for years, but it was only first regulated in 2024. So up until 2024, your environmental reports never were required to test for it. And they only are required to test for it if they have a belief that you have it. But if you have PFAS, PFOA, it's very difficult to mitigate, clean up, or to develop around it. So that's one of those ones. And part of the reason is because standards haven't been really established. So I wouldn't want to be a pioneer on this. And I think that banks will be very suspect if they believe that there's PFAS and PFOA. So that's probably the easiest one. I was looking at a site the other day, and it was what's called a biosolid site, which is loaded with these chemicals. So I just immediately rejected it because didn't need that brain damage. I didn't need a pioneer.
And where do you see the biggest opportunity in industrial land over the next 5 years?
Well, first of all, having land. Second of all, I mentioned South Dade. I mean, where there is land, right? South Dade, Palm Beach County. I think Port St. Lucie, which, is not an industrial market, but it is now today. At the time, there was, if you go up there, there's small, it's sort of like Miami or South Florida was 30, 40 years ago. People realized how costly land was, so they went up to there and they built a 1 million square foot building, but not just one person did it, 5 people did it. And in a market that didn't have that kind of product. So it's taking a little while for that to get absorbed. But once it does, that's going to be a real vibrant industrial market. So I think that has some interest after we absorb this first glob of development. I also, I told you South Dade, I think it's an opportunity. I think the other opportunity that is striking to me is I was helping a client out the other day, acquiring an asset that I had actually built 5, 7 years prior. The price at which he bought it, it's a Class A industrial asset. It's 75% stabilized. And so they have some vacancy in it, but still it's sold for $270 a foot. That building today would cost $320 to $350 a foot. So, I think the opportunity is on the acquire side if you can get these assets and people are trading them because you're buying it below replacement cost and they're already stabilized. And it's the same same building we're building today.
And if you were advising a younger developer entering the industrial space today, what would you tell them to focus on?
Cold calling. It's like an old tradition, but real estate is a personal business, right? I mean, there's a lot of information that's available now, but ultimately it's a personal business. People today, they'll send you a text, they'll send you an email, but pick up the phone and call. I think that's for a young person, that's the last thing they think to do. And I think it's, the people that make it in this business, the ones who aren't afraid to pick up the phone and call somebody and ask them a question.
My coach from Massimo Group would be so happy to hear that, because that's what they preach all the time. Got to pick up the phone and make those calls.
It's hard to do, but the guys that do it year after year, man, it pays dividends. And eventually you're not the one dialing. They're calling you.
And tell us a little bit about NAIOP. I've never dig more into it, but I know CCIM and Crew, we do events with them jointly.
By the way, Crew, CCIM, all those are great organizations. I happened to, when I was many years ago at Flagler, my boss was the president of NAIOP that year, and he's like, you've got no choice. It wasn't like I asked, it was like, you're doing this. So I joined, and it wasn't just join, it was join and you have to get on a committee, you got to participate. But because of that participation, I met some great people, great colleagues, and you never know where your next deal is coming from. And that was a good source and a good piece of advice, and I'm grateful to my boss who made me do it. Whether it's CCIM or SIOR or whatever organization, I think just be active, be involved, and plant yourself in a market like this.
Well, thank you so much, Brian. It has been a pleasure. I really appreciate you coming on with us, and I'm pretty sure that I have a lot of industrial people that are looking forward to listen to this episode with you.
Thank you very much for asking me on. It's been a pleasure.